My 26th birthday should have been a quiet, almost uneventful day, the kind where you treat yourself to a simple meal, maybe a drink, and remind yourself that surviving another year is worth acknowledging. Instead, it became the moment when my entire world cracked open. We were sitting at a long dining table in a trendy restaurant downtown, the kind of place my family only visited for appearances, when everything shifted. My parents had insisted on arranging the dinner, and although I felt uneasy about the expense, I told myself it would be harmless. One meal, a few hours, and then back to my modest life. But as the night went on, the tension in the air thickened. The waiters moved nervously around our table, and the chatter of other guests seemed to fade into a background hum. My sister sat directly across from me, her eyes glittering with the kind of smugness I had grown used to over the years. It was the same expression she wore whenever she knew something I didn't, whenever she had the upper hand. My parents, who normally maintained the facade of calm control, appeared distracted, whispering to one another between bites of food, their hands fidgeting with napkins and cutlery. I didn't know it then, but the carefully constructed version of reality I had lived with for decades was about to collapse. For most of my life, I had told myself that my family's dysfunction was normal. Every family has its issues, I thought, and I simply needed to endure mine until I could afford independence. Yet the truth was far uglier. My parents built their lives around control, secrecy, and favoritism, and my sister had always been the shining center of it all. From childhood, she had been the one praised, defended, excused. I had been the afterthought, the one whose efforts were dismissed, whose needs were minimized. That imbalance had been painful but predictable. What I hadn't realized was just how far they were willing to go to maintain it. The first sign came when the waiter placed a chilled bottle of champagne on the table. I couldn't imagine my parents spending so extravagantly, especially when they knew I was barely scraping by. The gesture felt performative, almost theatrical, as though they weren't celebrating me but staging a scene for someone else's benefit. My unease deepened with every course that arrived. Artfully plated dishes I could never have justified purchasing for myself. My sister reveled in it, laughing too loudly, her manicured nails catching the light as she gestured dramatically, soaking up attention while I sat quietly, shrinking further into myself. What struck me most that evening was the contrast between my life and theirs. I was living paycheck to paycheck, constantly calculating how long I could stretch my savings, wondering if this would be the month something finally gave way. My apartment was a small, dimly lit place on the edge of the city, filled with secondhand furniture and reminders of financial strain. I had no safety net, no backup plan, only the fragile hope that hard work would eventually carry me forward. My parents, on the other hand, lived in a house far too large for their needs, with cars they didn't need but flaunted anyway. And my sister floated through life as though money, effort, and accountability were foreign concepts. The imbalance that had defined my childhood was now defining my adulthood. And that night, at that table, it was as if the universe conspired to throw the truth into sharp relief. I noticed how my parents avoided my eyes whenever conversation shifted toward me. Questions about my work or living situation were answered with clipped nods or quickly diverted back towards safer ground. They didn't want to hear about my struggles, and they certainly didn't want to acknowledge their role in them. My sister, meanwhile, thrived in the spotlight, offering stories of her travels, her shopping, her glamorous social life, while my parents nodded along with adoration. It was painfully clear she was their investment, their chosen child, and I was the one left to fend for myself. And then, in a single moment, the mask slipped. Something was said. I wouldn't fully understand it until later, but it was enough to pull the curtain back. My sister's smirk widened, my parents' faces drained of color, and for the first time in my life, I realized the scale of their deception. They hadn't simply favored her. They had taken from me, hidden things from me, constructed an entire version of reality where I was meant to remain small while she was elevated. That dinner, which was supposed to mark the quiet passage of another year, became the night everything I thought I knew about my family shattered. I walked out of that restaurant not only with a hollow pit in my stomach, but with the growing certainty that my family wasn't just flawed. They were dangerous to me. And my sister, who had always reveled in her position above me, had no idea that one day she would see me rise from the wreckage they created. Looking back, I realized that my childhood was a constant lesson in being measured against someone else's standard. From my earliest memories, I was cast as the shadow while my sister was placed in the spotlight. She was the one with the perfect grades, the carefully curated talents, and the charm that seemed to captivate every adult in the room. I was the background noise, the one whose accomplishments were never quite enough, whose mistakes were magnified until they defined me. At the time, I thought this was simply the way families worked. Some children are adored, others tolerated. But as I grew older, I began to understand the corrosive effect of constant comparison. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a system of control, a hierarchy carefully maintained by my parents to keep me dependent and diminished while elevating her as the golden child. My earliest years were filled with small but cutting reminders of this imbalance. When I brought home artwork from school, it was placed on the refrigerator for a day or two before being quietly replaced by my sister's projects. My achievements in sports or academics were acknowledged briefly, then overshadowed by whatever she happened to be doing at the time. I learned to expect that anything I did would be considered ordinary, while everything she touched would be celebrated. The emotional impact of that dynamic seeped into every aspect of my personality. I grew cautious, hesitant, constantly second-guessing whether I should even try to stand out. My sister, by contrast, thrived under the endless praise, developing a sense of entitlement that only grew stronger as we got older. She moved through life with the certainty that the world owed her admiration, while I learned to live with the weight of invisibility. The financial imbalance was just as striking. Birthdays and holidays became painful reminders of where I stood in the family hierarchy. She received expensive gifts, designer clothes, electronics, lavish experiences, while mine were practical, modest, and sometimes clearly chosen at the last minute. I remember sitting in living rooms filled with extended family, watching her unwrap one extravagant present after another, while my own small pile sat untouched. The message was always clear: she was worth investing in, and I was not. As I entered adolescence, the differences between us widened. She was given every opportunity: private lessons, extracurricular activities, summer programs that broadened her social network. I had to beg for basic supplies, and most of my interests were dismissed as hobbies that weren't worth supporting. When I wanted to join a school trip abroad, I was told there wasn't enough money, only to watch my sister travel months later on an even more expensive excursion. The contradictions piled up, each one another reminder of where I stood. But what hurt more than the material disparities was the silence. I was never truly seen or heard in my own home. My thoughts, feelings, and struggles were treated as inconveniences, background noise that disrupted the image my parents wanted to project. My sister's life, on the other hand, was treated as a family project. Every small achievement of hers was magnified, every setback smoothed over, every failure quickly reframed as a lesson on her inevitable path to success. It wasn't until high school that I began to realize how much this dynamic had shaped me. While my sister developed a persona built on confidence and charm, I developed a quiet resilience born of neglect. I learned how to work hard, not because I was encouraged to, but because I had no other choice. If I wanted new clothes, I had to earn the money myself. If I wanted to attend an event or buy materials for a project, I had to find a way to fund it on my own. These small acts of independence gave me strength, but they also reinforced the painful truth. I was on my own, even within my own family. The contrast between us followed me everywhere. Teachers, relatives, even neighbors would comment on how impressive my sister was, often in the same breath they used to dismiss me. I became accustomed to hearing that she was destined for greatness while I was simply there. My parents never corrected those impressions. In fact, they seemed to encourage them. Their entire identity as a family seemed tied to her accomplishments, while my existence was something they barely acknowledged. There were moments when I convinced myself that things would change. I told myself that once I graduated, once I built a life of my own, I would finally be free of the comparisons. But deep down, I knew the truth. The damage had already been done. The years of being overlooked, minimized, and used as a foil to highlight her brilliance had left scars that I carried into adulthood. As I entered my 20s, the pattern continued, only now the stakes were higher. My sister was supported in every endeavor, no matter how impractical or costly. She was provided with the resources to succeed, or at least to appear successful, while I continued to struggle alone. Every paycheck I earned was carefully budgeted, every decision weighed against the risk of financial collapse. Meanwhile, she lived without consequence, knowing that our parents would always catch her if she fell. The bitterness of those years settled deep inside me. Even when I tried to bury it, I told myself I didn't need their approval, that I could build a life without their help, and to some extent, I did. But the resentment remained, a constant undercurrent that colored every interaction with them. Every phone call, every family gathering, every forced smile carried the weight of decades of inequality. It was this history that made the events of my 26th birthday so devastating. It wasn't just the discovery of betrayal, it was the realization that the favoritism I had endured my whole life wasn't just emotional, it was financial, structural, intentional. My sister hadn't simply been favored, she had been handed opportunities and resources that were denied to me, and my parents had actively participated in the deception. That night at the restaurant, as the truth began to unravel, I felt the weight of my entire childhood pressing down on me. Every comparison, every dismissal, every moment of invisibility suddenly made sense. They had never intended for me to thrive. My role had always been to serve as the background, the shadow against which my sister's brilliance could shine. The realization was crushing, but it was also clarifying. For the first time, I saw my family for what they truly were. Not flawed but loving, not misguided but well-meaning, but fundamentally destructive. The imbalance that had defined my childhood had not been accidental. It had been deliberate, calculated, and sustained. And in that understanding, I found a strange sense of strength. If my survival until now had been without their support, then my future could be built entirely without them. My childhood of comparisons had left me scarred, but it had also left me strong. And as much as my family had tried to destroy me, I knew one truth above all else. The life I would build would not be theirs to control. Adulthood came to me not as a choice, but as a necessity. I entered it carrying the same baggage I had accumulated throughout my childhood. The quiet knowledge that, if I was to survive, it would have to be through my own efforts. While my sister floated effortlessly into her 20s with the safety net of my parents beneath her, I stepped out into the world already bracing for impact. College was my first real taste of independence, though it was anything but glamorous. I financed my education through a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and scholarships that I fought tooth and nail to earn. My parents contributed nothing, insisting that I needed to learn the value of hard work. Though they never imposed the same lesson on my sister, she was given full support, her tuition covered, her living arrangements secured, her every need quietly met. I, on the other hand, worked nights in cramped kitchens, weekends in retail, and weekdays juggling assignments between shifts. There was a strange pride in those years, knowing I was surviving against the odds, but pride did little to soften the exhaustion. I remember nights when I returned to my tiny dorm room too tired to even eat, collapsing on the narrow mattress still in my work clothes. My classmates spoke of internships and networking events, of study abroad opportunities and graduate programs, while I calculated whether I could afford textbooks and groceries in the same week. Every decision was survival-based, every choice narrowed by lack of resources, and yet, despite the struggle, I managed. I graduated, not with honors or accolades, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured. My student debt loomed like a shadow over my future, but I told myself that earning a degree was worth the sacrifice. My sister, meanwhile, celebrated her own milestones with family-funded parties, internships secured through connections, and a future that seemed paved with gold. After graduation, reality struck with full force. The job market was unforgiving, and I quickly learned that a degree was no guarantee of stability. I found work where I could, low-paying, often temporary positions that barely covered the cost of rent. My first apartment was a dim, drafty place shared with strangers, its walls thin enough to hear every argument and late-night television program. Still, it was mine, and for a brief moment that was enough. But independence came at a cost. Every month was a balancing act between bills, debt payments, and basic necessities. I lived with a constant sense of anxiety, the fear that one unexpected expense could undo everything. There were times when I skipped meals to make sure rent was paid, when I walked long distances rather than pay for transportation, when I convinced myself that frugality was strength rather than desperation. My parents knew of my struggles, but they offered no assistance. In their eyes, my hardships were lessons, proof that I was being forged into resilience. What they refused to acknowledge was the cruelty of watching me stumble, while they stood idly by, ready to rescue only my sister. She lived in an apartment they helped furnish, her bills quietly supplemented by their money, her mistakes shielded from consequence. While I drowned in debt and uncertainty, she thrived in the illusion of independence, unaware of what it truly meant. The contrast grew heavier with each passing year. I worked tirelessly, taking on second jobs when necessary, saving scraps in the hope of building a future. My sister spent her weekends traveling, posting curated snapshots of her life on social media. her luxury visible to anyone watching. Relatives praised her success, attributing it to her ambition and charm, while my own efforts went unnoticed. No one saw the nights I stayed awake staring at overdue bills, the panic of wondering whether I could afford to visit a doctor if I got sick, the exhaustion of working hours that left no room for rest. Despite it all, I carried on. There was a stubbornness in me, a refusal to let their neglect define me completely. I began to build small routines that grounded me: morning walks before work, evenings spent reading borrowed books, weekends devoted to reorganizing my space, so it felt less temporary. These were quiet victories, invisible to everyone but me, yet they sustained me through the constant grind. There were moments of despair, times when I questioned whether I would ever escape the cycle. I watched peers from more supportive families move confidently into careers, buy homes, start families, while I felt trapped in survival mode. Every step forward seemed to come with a setback, every achievement dulled by the knowledge that it had been purchased with sacrifice others had been spared. The bitterness of comparison lingered, even when I tried to ignore it. What I didn't realize then was how much these years were shaping me. The struggle was relentless, but it also gave me a resilience that my sister, for all her privilege, would never possess. I learned how to navigate hardship, how to adapt, how to survive in a world that had given me little. It was a painful education, but it was mine. Still, the resentment never fully left me. Each phone call with my parents was a reminder of their indifference. Each gathering was an exhibition of my sister's successes, framed as proof of her brilliance, while my own achievements were brushed aside as obligations I was simply expected to meet. The imbalance of my childhood had carried seamlessly into adulthood, and I began to wonder if it would ever end. The years of early independence hardened me, but they also left me vulnerable in ways I didn't yet understand. The constant grind had stripped me of trust, of the ability to believe in others' support. I had built my identity on self-reliance, and while it kept me afloat, it also isolated me. When opportunities did arise, I struggled to accept them, suspicious of anything that came too easily. It was as though I had internalized the belief that suffering was my natural state, that anything else must be temporary or undeserved. What I could not see at the time was how this foundation of struggle would collide with the secrets my family had been hiding. My years of independence had been forged in the absence of support, but the truth, when it emerged, would reveal that I had not merely been neglected. I had been actively undermined. The money, the resources, the opportunities that could have changed everything had existed, but they had been withheld, diverted, or stolen. That realization had not yet come. At this stage of my life, I still believed that my struggles were simply the price of adulthood. I still told myself that if I worked hard enough, saved diligently, and endured, I would eventually build a stable life. But beneath that fragile hope was the unspoken truth I had carried since childhood. My family was not simply indifferent. They were the architects of my hardship. The weight of independence was heavy, but I bore it alone, unaware that the very people who should have supported me were the same ones ensuring I remained burdened. And as I pushed forward into the uncertain years ahead, I carried with me the scars of that neglect, not knowing that the greatest betrayal was still waiting to be uncovered. There are moments in life that appear ordinary at first, so small that they barely register, and yet they end up being the hinges upon which everything else turns. For me, the moment came when my sister asked for my help. After years of watching her live a life of ease, insulated from consequences by my parents, it seemed almost surreal to imagine her needing anything from me. I should have questioned it more. I should have recognized the warning signs. But after years of being dismissed and overlooked, the request felt like an opening, a chance to finally bridge the distance that had always existed between us. By then, I had already built a fragile existence of independence. I was working constantly, juggling jobs, managing bills, and slowly carving out the semblance of stability. My life was far from glamorous, but it was mine, and I had built it without their help. I had learned to budget with precision, to stretch every dollar until it almost tore apart, and I guarded what little I had with a kind of fierce pride. Still, beneath that independence lingered a quiet longing for acknowledgement, for connection, for some sign that I mattered to them after all. So, when my sister turned to me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe she finally saw me as more than the shadow in her spotlight. Hope that she recognized my strength, my resilience, and needed me in a way that went beyond convenience. The irony, of course, is that hope can blind us more effectively than denial. It makes us believe in possibilities that do not exist, trust in people who have already proven themselves unworthy. And in that blindness, I made a choice that would alter everything. The request was for money. It wasn't presented as desperation, but as an opportunity. She framed it as temporary, a situation that would resolve itself in a matter of months. She needed a boost, a contribution, something that I alone could provide. To anyone else, it might have sounded like an ordinary transaction, but to me, it was more than that. It was a chance to rewrite the story of my relationship with her. To finally move from being the overlooked sibling to being the one she could rely on. I told myself that helping her would change things, that this would prove my worth not only to her, but to my parents as well. I convinced myself that generosity could soften the years of bitterness, that sacrifice could buy me the belonging I had been denied. It wasn't just about money, it was about love, about validation, about the desperate desire to finally be seen. The decision wasn't easy. I didn't have much to give. Every dollar I saved was earmarked for my escape. For the day I could finally move into a better apartment, free myself from the cycle of constant survival, and build a future that wasn't dictated by their neglect. Handing over those savings meant delaying that dream, pushing my independence further into the distance. But the weight of loneliness, of invisibility, was heavier than the financial sacrifice. I convinced myself it was worth it. The moment I handed over the money, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear, because I knew how much this cost me. Exhilaration, because for the first time, my sister seemed to need me. For a fleeting second, I believed that maybe things were changing, that maybe I had finally carved out a place in their world where I wasn't just tolerated, but valued. But hope, as I would soon learn, is a dangerous illusion. Weeks passed, and the promised repayment never came. At first, I brushed it aside, reminding myself that these things take time. Life is unpredictable, circumstances shift, and I didn't want to believe the worst. I told myself that trust required patience, that if I clung too tightly to expectation, I would ruin the fragile bond I thought I was building. Yet, as the months dragged on, the silence grew louder. My sister carried on with her life as if nothing had happened. Her lifestyle unchanged, her confidence undisturbed. I, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting. Bills piled up, savings dwindled, and the dream of independence slipped further from reach. Each time I thought about asking her, I hesitated, terrified that pressing the issue would shatter the illusion of closeness. It was only later, long after the truth had come to light, that I recognized the cruelty of it all. My sacrifice had meant nothing to her. The money wasn't a bridge between us. It was simply another resource for her to consume, another way for my parents to remind me of my place. They had raised her to believe that everything existed for her benefit, and I had fallen into the trap of confirming it once again. What hurt most wasn't the financial loss, though that was devastating. It was the realization that I had betrayed myself in the process. I had ignored the lessons of my past, the patterns that had defined our family dynamic, and had allowed myself to believe that this time would be different. I had taken the very little I had built for myself and handed it over to the very person who had always been placed above me. That decision became the turning point. It was the crack in the fragile foundation of my life that allowed everything else to crumble. My sister's smugness grew bolder, my parents' dismissiveness more pointed, and I began to see clearly what I had tried so hard not to acknowledge. I was never going to be valued by them. My worth in their eyes was not tied to who I was, but to what I could give up. The request for help had seemed so simple at the time, so small compared to the years of struggle I had endured, but in reality, it was the beginning of the end. It was the moment that set the stage for the betrayals yet to come. The moment when I realized that my family wasn't just careless with me. They were willing to destroy me if it meant preserving the illusion of their golden child. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, there was no going back from that. The money was gone, the dream of independence delayed, and the hope I had clung to was shattered. What remained was the slow, painful awareness that I had been played, not just by my sister, but by the entire system of favoritism and control that had defined my family from the very beginning. The request for help had not been about trust, or love, or even necessity. It had been about power. And by giving in, I had unknowingly handed them more of it. Time has a way of revealing truths we don't want to face. In the weeks after I gave my sister the money, I tried to convince myself that patience was the key. I repeated the story she had told me in my mind like a mantra, convincing myself that repayment was only a matter of time. I told myself that she was busy, that circumstances had delayed her, that her promise still held weight. For a while, I clung to that illusion because the alternative, that I had been used, manipulated, and discarded, was too painful to admit. But as the weeks stretched into months, the silence became deafening. There was no acknowledgement, no mention of what I had given up, no sign that repayment was even a consideration. My sister continued her life as though nothing had happened, her world untouched by the sacrifice that had cost me so much. Her clothes were still new, her outings still extravagant, her confidence still unshaken. If she had been struggling, I might have understood. If she had shown even the slightest awareness of the burden I had taken on, I might have forgiven. But there was nothing. It was as though my contribution had vanished into a void, erased not only from her memory but from the family's as well. What struck me most was the complete lack of recognition from my parents. They knew what had happened. They had seen me hand over my savings, had watched me delay my own goals for the sake of their favored child. Yet they treated it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as though my sacrifice was expected, obligatory, not worthy of gratitude or even acknowledgement. They spoke of her successes with pride, her lifestyle with admiration, while I was left to quietly shoulder the weight of what I had lost. At first, I tried to rationalize their silence. Perhaps they believed repayment would come soon and saw no need to interfere. Perhaps they thought my sister and I were working it out privately and they didn't want to intrude. But as time passed, their indifference revealed itself for what it was: complicity. They weren't ignoring the situation out of respect. They were erasing it, rewriting it as though it had never happened. In their version of events, my sacrifice was not a betrayal, but a duty, something I owed to my sister simply because of who she was. The bitterness grew slowly at first, a quiet gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I noticed it in the small moments, when I skipped meals to stretch my budget, when I walked past store windows filled with things I couldn't afford, when I returned to my tiny apartment and stared at the peeling paint on the walls. Each sacrifice was a reminder of what I had given up, of how easily my sister had consumed what had taken me years to build. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what the money represented: my independence, my escape, my future. I had poured all of that into her hands, believing it would bring me closer to her, to them, to a sense of belonging I had been denied my whole life. Instead, it left me further behind, stripped of the fragile security I had managed to piece together. What hurt most was the way they all carried on as though nothing had happened. Family gatherings became unbearable. My sister would boast about her latest purchases or trips, my parents would beam with pride, and I would sit in silence, swallowing my resentment like poison. No one mentioned the debt, no one asked how I was managing, no one cared that I had sacrificed everything while she thrived. There were nights when the anger kept me awake, burning hotter than the hunger I sometimes felt when I couldn't afford a proper meal. I replayed the moment in my mind, over and over, the hope I had felt, the trust I had extended, the belief that this time would be different. Each memory was a reminder of my own naivety, of how easily I had been fooled once again. The betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow suffocation, a steady realization that I had been cast in the same role I had always played, the one who gave while she only ever received. My parents reinforced the imbalance with their silence. They never spoke of repayment, never held her accountable, never acknowledged the unfairness of it all. Instead, they doubled down on the narrative that she was exceptional, deserving, entitled to more than the rest of us. I began to see clearly what I had tried to deny. Their love was conditional, their support selective, their loyalty reserved for her alone. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. My savings were gone, my dream of moving into a better place delayed indefinitely, and the constant grind of survival felt heavier than ever. I took on more hours at work, cut back on what little I allowed myself, and lived with the constant anxiety of knowing that one setback could undo me completely. Meanwhile, my sister flaunted a life untouched by struggle, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the cost I had borne for her comfort. What made it unbearable was the realization that my family did not see this as betrayal. To them, it was simply the natural order of things. She was the one worth investing in, and I was the one expected to sacrifice. My pain was irrelevant, my struggles invisible, my future negotiable. They had always treated me this way, but now I saw it for what it was. Not neglect, not oversight, but a deliberate system of favoritism designed to keep me small while elevating her. It was in those months that the bitterness hardened into something sharper. I no longer believed that time would fix things, or that repayment would eventually come. I began to understand that the money was gone forever, not just in a practical sense, but in a symbolic one. It had been absorbed into the family dynamic, another example of my role as the one who gave without ever receiving. And yet, beneath the anger, there was a flicker of clarity. For the first time, I saw the truth of my family without illusion. They weren't simply flawed people who made mistakes. They were destructive, manipulative, and entirely unwilling to change. My sister would never repay me, my parents would never hold her accountable, and I would never be anything more to them than a resource to be drained. That realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. The promise of repayment had vanished, and with it, the last remnants of hope that my family would ever treat me with fairness. What remained was the stark, undeniable truth. They were destroying me, and if I stayed within their reach, they always would. For a long time, I thought the money I had given my sister was the end of it. It was painful enough watching my small savings disappear into her hands and vanish without acknowledgement, but I believed that was the extent of the betrayal. I told myself that the lesson had been learned, that I would never put myself in such a position again. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. The truth revealed itself slowly, in fragments that at first seemed insignificant. A comment overheard, a document left out in the open, a slip of the tongue that was quickly covered. Each piece on its own was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed a picture that left me breathless. What I had taken as neglect or favoritism was, in reality, something far darker. My family had not only taken my savings, they had taken my future. It began with paperwork. I was digging through a stack of old files one afternoon, looking for tax records, when I noticed something that didn't belong. It was a copy of a statement from an account I had never heard of, listing assets in my name that I had no memory of ever controlling. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps it had been sent to me in error, or perhaps it was some long-forgotten account opened during college. But as I read further, the dates didn't match. The balances were too high, and the withdrawals were far too deliberate. The numbers told a story I hadn't been aware of. There had been resources, money, and opportunities allocated to me, things I should have had access to, things that could have changed the course of my life, but they had been siphoned away, managed by others, redirected into places I could not reach. And when I thought back to all the times I had begged for support, all the times I had struggled alone, the realization hit with crushing force. They had known. They had known all along that I wasn't meant to struggle, that I had been given a foundation, but they had chosen to keep it from me. My mind spiraled through memories I had long buried, the times my parents dismissed my requests for help, telling me that independence was a lesson I needed to learn, the times my sister's life seemed unnaturally cushioned, her comforts inexplicable given her lack of effort, the vacations, the shopping sprees, the effortless ease with which she lived. It hadn't been luck or generosity from my parents. It had been mine. They had taken from me to give to her, and they had done it without hesitation, without guilt, without remorse. The discovery consumed me. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the pounding thought that every hardship I had endured had been unnecessary. The years of exhaustion, of fear, of stretching myself thin just to survive, they hadn't been a test of character, as my parents liked to claim. They had been theft. My family had orchestrated my suffering, all while congratulating themselves for raising me to be resilient. The more I uncovered, the worse it became. I learned that an apartment had been purchased in my name, a property I had never stepped foot in, never even known existed. On paper, it was mine, yet in reality, it had been quietly handed to my sister, who used it as though it were her own. The audacity of it was staggering. While I lived in cramped spaces, counting every penny, there had been a place waiting for me, secured and stable, stolen before I even knew it was there. It wasn't just the apartment, There were accounts, investments, and resources that had been systematically drained, all under the pretense of being managed on my behalf. In truth, they had been funding my sister's life of ease, padding my parents' comfort, and leaving me with nothing but scraps. Each new detail was like a knife, cutting deeper into the fragile illusion I had clung to. The betrayal went beyond money. It was the deliberate erasure of my autonomy, the decision to withhold from me the very tools that could have freed me. They had ensured that I remained dependent, struggling, while they funneled every advantage toward her. It was favoritism taken to its extreme, favoritism weaponized into theft. I thought about the years I had spent working multiple jobs, the nights I had gone hungry, the debt that weighed on me like an anchor. I thought about the humiliation of asking for help and being denied, the shame of believing I was somehow less capable, less deserving. All of it had been unnecessary. The tools to build a better life had been mine, but they had hidden them, diverted them, stolen them, and then watched me suffer. What unsettled me most was how normal they made it all seem. They carried on as though nothing was wrong, as though my struggles were simply part of the natural order of things. My sister lived with a smug confidence, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the fact that her comfort came at the cost of my suffering. My parents maintained their facade of wisdom and discipline, insisting that I was being taught responsibility, all while draining me of the very future they pretended to prepare me for. The weight of the discovery was almost unbearable. I felt as though my entire life had been rewritten in an instant. Every memory was colored by the knowledge of what had been hidden from me. Every hardship became a reminder of their betrayal, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't a single act of deceit. It was a pattern, a deliberate choice repeated over and over across the years. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my time, my opportunities, my sense of self. They had watched me build resilience from ashes they themselves had created, and they had congratulated themselves for it. They had stood by while I drowned, holding the lifeline just out of reach, and then praised me for learning how to swim. The anger that followed was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't the sharp, fleeting anger of childhood arguments or petty rivalries. It was deep, corrosive, all-consuming. It burned through every attempt I'd ever made to excuse them, to believe that they cared, to hope that things could change. It left me raw, stripped of illusion, and aware of a truth I could never unsee. My family had not only failed me, they had destroyed me. And yet, even as the anger grew, so did something else. A clarity, a resolve. For the first time in my life, I understood that I would never find fairness or love within those walls. My survival had always been mine alone, and my future would be too. The discovery of what they had taken was devastating, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to wonder where I stood, no longer had to hope for scraps of affection or fairness. The truth was out, and it was brutal, but it was real. They had stolen from me, lied to me, erased me, but in doing so, they had given me the one gift they never intended, the clarity to finally walk away. The truth was no longer something I could keep buried. For weeks, I had carried the weight of what I had uncovered, each new piece of evidence pressing harder against the fragile wall of silence I had built around myself. The documents, the accounts, the property that was supposed to be mine, all of it had been taken, and I could not ignore it any longer. My anger had sharpened into something uncontainable, and eventually it pushed me toward the inevitable. I confronted them. It wasn't a carefully planned confrontation. I didn't gather them together with measured words or calculated timing. It erupted out of me, raw and unfiltered, because the betrayal had become unbearable to carry alone. I laid out what I had found, one piece at a time, each revelation striking like a hammer against the false image they had spent years constructing. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the truth would shatter them, that faced with undeniable evidence, they would show remorse, shame, even regret. I wanted them to look me in the eye and admit what they had done. I wanted them to acknowledge the years of struggle I had endured unnecessarily, the nights I had gone without sleep or food, the opportunities I had lost. I wanted them to feel the weight of the choices they had made. But instead of remorse, I was met with denial. It wasn't even the frantic kind of denial that comes from panic. It was calm, practiced, almost rehearsed. They acted as though I had misunderstood, as though I had twisted the facts into something sinister. My anger was painted as paranoia, my discoveries reframed as mistakes. It was as if I had walked into a theater and interrupted a performance, and rather than admitting the script was false, they simply doubled down on their roles. The more I pushed, the colder they became. My pain was not acknowledged, it was dismissed. My evidence was not addressed, it was minimized. The accounts, the apartment, the money, they spoke of them as though they were trivial details, not the foundations of my future. And when dismissal no longer sufficed, they turned to blame. I was ungrateful, they implied. I was dramatic, selfish, too focused on what I had lost, rather than what I had supposedly gained. My sister sat with the same smug expression she had worn my entire life, a silent reminder that she was untouchable. She didn't need to defend herself because our parents did it for her. They circled around her like guards, shielding her from consequence, turning every accusation I raised into a reflection of my supposed bitterness. It didn't matter that the documents bore my name, that the property had been meant for me, that the money had been stolen from my future. In their version of reality, I was not a victim, I was the problem. The realization settled in slowly, heavier than any evidence I had uncovered. This was not just theft. This was a conspiracy of silence, a deliberate rewriting of truth that left no space for accountability. They would never admit what they had done because to do so would unravel the very structure of their lives. Their comfort, their pride, their carefully curated image of a perfect family, it all depended on erasing my suffering, on pretending that nothing had been stolen, that I was simply jealous, resentful, or misguided. The confrontation left me more isolated than I had ever felt before. I had gone into it with the faintest hope that truth might spark change, that somewhere beneath the favoritism and control there remained a shred of decency, but what I found was a wall, impenetrable, unyielding, indifferent. They had made their choice long ago, and it had not been me. Walking away from that moment, I carried no victory, no satisfaction, only a hollow ache. The truth was mine, but it meant nothing to them. I had laid bare the theft of my future, and they had met it with indifference. In that indifference was the final confirmation of what I had always known, but never wanted to admit. I did not belong to them, not in the way that mattered. The confrontation did not destroy the family. It revealed that it had already been destroyed long before. What remained was a performance, one that I was no longer willing to take part in. After the confrontation, I expected nothing to change. My parents had perfected the art of denial, and my sister had long ago learned that her place in the world was secured by their unwavering protection. I assumed they would simply go on pretending, and in many ways, they did. Inside those walls, the script continued as it always had. She was the chosen one. I was the burden, and any mention of what had been stolen was treated as if it had never been spoken. But the outside world is harder to control. Appearances can be maintained only so long before the cracks begin to show. And once they did, there was no stopping the slow unraveling of the image they had built. It began with whispers. Extended relatives who had always fawned over my sister began to notice inconsistencies. Her lifestyle was too extravagant, her comforts too polished, her stories too perfect. Questions started to surface, quietly at first, spoken in half-finished sentences and suspicious glances. How was she affording all of this? Where was the money coming from? My parents brushed the questions aside with the same confidence they used to dismiss me. But doubt had already been planted. Neighbors noticed too. The flashy cars, the constant deliveries, the endless renovations. All of it clashed with the narrative of a family that claimed to value discipline and hard work. People who had once admired them began to see the excess for what it was, a performance funded not by effort but by something else entirely. What my parents had worked so hard to hide was no longer invisible. For me, there was a strange kind of vindication in watching the facade collapse. For years, I had been made to feel invisible, my struggles erased by their carefully curated image of success. Now, finally, others were beginning to see through it. But the vindication was bitter, because the damage had already been done. I had lost years of my life, years of independence, years of peace, all so they could maintain a lie. Watching that lie crumble did nothing to restore what I had lost. The cracks widened as more details emerged, documents surfaced, connections were pieced together, and soon it became impossible to ignore the truth. Relatives who once defended them began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Family gatherings grew tense, smaller, until eventually they stopped altogether. The circle that had once revolved around my parents and my sister began to dissolve, leaving them exposed in ways they had never imagined. My sister, who had always thrived on attention, struggled the most. For years, she had been the golden child, admired and envied, her life a constant parade of validation. But as whispers turned into accusations, the admiration she had relied on disappeared. Friends grew distant, opportunities closed, and the praise that once came so easily was replaced with skepticism. Her smug confidence faltered, though she tried desperately to maintain it. Watching her stumble was unsettling. A part of me had longed for this moment, but another part recognized the emptiness of it. Her fall did not heal me. It only highlighted the depth of what had been stolen. My parents fought harder than ever to preserve the image, but their efforts only accelerated the collapse. They doubled down on their lies, insisting that nothing was wrong, that everything was as it should be. But denial has limits. The more they insisted, the more people questioned, and the more isolated they became. Their social circle, once expansive and secure, dwindled to almost nothing. Invitations stopped coming, calls went unanswered, and the people they had spent years trying to impress moved on without them. For me, the unraveling brought a strange mixture of emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated. The truth I had carried alone for so long was finally visible to others. I was no longer the only one who saw through their facade. On the other hand, it left me hollow. I had spent years yearning for them to be exposed, imagining that it would bring some sense of justice or closure. But when it finally happened, it felt anticlimactic. Their fall did not erase my suffering. It did not restore the years I had lost, the opportunities that had been stolen, the scars I carried. It simply confirmed what I had always known. They had destroyed me, and no amount of public disgrace could undo it. The hardest part was realizing that even as the masks fell, they still refused to change. They did not admit what they had done. They did not apologize, or seek forgiveness, or attempt to repair the damage. Instead, they clung to the remnants of their illusion, insisting that they were victims of gossip, misunderstood, unfairly judged. It was almost impressive, the way they could twist reality even in the face of undeniable evidence. Their refusal to face the truth was as steadfast as it had ever been. The fall of their image marked the end of any hope I had once held for reconciliation. If exposure could not force them to change, nothing ever would. I began to understand that justice would not come from them admitting their guilt, but from me choosing to walk away. Their collapse was not my victory. It was simply the natural consequence of years of deceit finally catching up to them. And yet, even as I stepped further from their world, I could not escape the echoes of what had been lost. Every reminder of their downfall, the empty invitations, the hushed conversations, the fading admiration of others, was also a reminder of the life I might have had if they had chosen differently. Their masks had fallen, but the damage they had done to me remained. In the end, the unraveling of their facade did not bring the catharsis I had imagined. It brought only clarity. The world could now see what I had always known, but that did not heal me. It only solidified the truth. My family had built their lives on lies, and I had been the cost of keeping those lies alive. After the masks of my family began to fall, I was left with an emptiness that frightened me more than the betrayal itself. For years, my identity had been tied to them, whether I wanted it to be or not. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every desperate attempt at validation had revolved around their approval or their neglect. When their facade finally crumbled, I realized I had nothing left tethering me to them. It should have felt freeing, but in truth, it felt like being untied in the middle of a storm, drifting with no clear direction. The first days were the hardest. I woke up each morning with the weight of betrayal pressing down on me, unsure of how to even begin. My savings were gone, my trust was shattered, and my sense of self had been eroded by years of being diminished. For a long time, I existed in survival mode, moving through the motions of daily life without really living. Work, meals, sleep. They all blended together in a fog that felt unending. But, slowly, something began to shift. It was not a dramatic revelation or a sudden surge of strength. It was quiet, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew. I realized that if my family had stolen everything they could from me, the one thing they hadn't destroyed was my ability to rebuild. They had left me with nothing, but nothing could also be a beginning. The rebuilding started small. I focused on the basics, the parts of my life that had been neglected while I carried the burden of their betrayal. I organized my space, decluttering the reminders of years spent scraping by. I made lists of goals, not grand dreams, but simple, attainable steps. Pay off one bill at a time, save a little each week, apply for new positions that offered more stability. Each checkmark on those lists became a small act of defiance, proof that I could create a future without them. There was a strange power in reclaiming routines for myself. Cooking meals became more than sustenance. It was an act of care I had long denied myself. Going for walks in the morning became a way of reminding myself that the world was larger than the walls of resentment I had grown up in. I filled my time with reading, with journaling, with moments of reflection that allowed me to process the anger without being consumed by it. For the first time, I began to imagine a future that wasn't shaped by their shadow. It was fragile, almost frightening to picture, but it was mine. Support came in unexpected places. Friends I had kept at arm's length began to step closer, offering kindness without demanding explanations. Colleagues noticed my effort at work and encouraged me in ways my own family never had. Even strangers, people with no stake in my story, provided fleeting moments of compassion that reminded me that not everyone existed to take. I started to build connections that felt genuine, relationships rooted not in obligation or manipulation, but in mutual respect. These small bonds became the foundation of what I began to call my chosen family. People who saw me, who valued me, not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. It was a revelation, realizing that family could exist beyond blood, that loyalty could come from choice rather than obligation. Rebuilding was not linear. There were nights when the bitterness returned, when I lay awake replaying every moment of betrayal, every sacrifice that had been stolen. The anger came in waves, sometimes so strong it left me shaking. But instead of letting it drown me, I learned to ride it. I began to accept that healing did not mean forgetting, that moving forward did not mean erasing the past. It meant carrying it differently, letting it inform me rather than define me. I found strength in work, not just as a means of survival, but as a way to prove to myself that I could create something lasting. I took on projects with renewed determination, pouring into them the energy I had once wasted chasing my family's approval. Slowly, recognition followed. Opportunities opened, small but significant, and each one was a reminder that I was not powerless. As I rebuilt, I began to see my sister differently. For so long, she had been the center of my resentment, the embodiment of everything I had been denied. But now, watching her struggle under the weight of her fading image, I realized she was just as trapped as I had been, only in a different way. Her identity had been built on lies, on the constant validation of others, on the illusion of success. Without that, she had nothing. Where I had learned to survive, she had never been forced to. And while I was rebuilding, she was unraveling. That realization didn't erase the pain of what she had taken from me, but it shifted something inside me. I no longer saw her as untouchable. She was vulnerable, fragile, and for the first time, I understood that my strength did not depend on her downfall. My strength came from standing without her, without them. The process of rebuilding was slow, but each step was a quiet victory. I opened a new account, started saving again, even if the numbers were small. I applied for opportunities I once thought beyond my reach and began to receive responses that affirmed my efforts. I allowed myself to dream again, not in grand terms, but in practical, hopeful ones. A stable home, a secure future, a life defined by my choices rather than their betrayal. For so long, my story had been about loss of money, of opportunity, of family, but now, slowly, it became a story of reclamation. I had been broken, yes, but in the breaking I had discovered a resilience I never knew I possessed. I was no longer simply surviving. I was beginning to live. And though the scars of betrayal remained, I carried them differently. They were no longer just wounds. They were reminders of what I had endured, proof of what I could overcome. My family had tried to destroy me, But in doing so, they had revealed a strength in me that even I hadn't believed was there. The rebuilding was not complete, not yet. But for the first time in my life, I believed it was possible. And that belief, fragile as it was, became the foundation of everything that would come next. 4 months, I had lived with the uneasy balance of knowledge and uncertainty. I knew what had been taken from me. I knew the patterns of manipulation and theft, but much of it had remained fragmented, pieces of evidence, scattered truths, hints of something larger than I could fully grasp. It was enough to convince me of their betrayal, but part of me still questioned whether I had exaggerated, whether bitterness had magnified what I had uncovered. My family had always been skilled at twisting perception, and their denial had left me wondering if I had allowed anger to blind me. That doubt ended the day I found the proof. It didn't arrive dramatically, not in the form of a confrontation or a confession, but quietly, tucked away in places where they thought I would never look. A collection of records, contracts, and transfers that, when pieced together, told a story that could not be denied. It was all there in black and white, the accounts drained, the property reassigned, the inheritance redirected. Each line, each signature, each transfer of funds was another nail in the coffin of their lies. What stunned me most wasn't the existence of the proof, it was the scale of it. I had thought the betrayal was limited to a few accounts, perhaps one property, but the documents revealed a systematic pattern stretching back years. It wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment, it was deliberate, calculated, and relentless. They had planned it, executed it, and hidden it, all while watching me struggle to survive. As I sifted through the pages, a numbness settled over me. It was one thing to suspect betrayal, another to live with the bitterness of unacknowledged theft, but to see it laid out so clearly was something else entirely. It stripped away the last fragments of denial I had clung to. There was no room for reinterpretation, no possibility of miscommunication. They had stolen from me, and they had done it knowingly. I thought about the years I had lived in scarcity. Every decision weighed against survival. The nights I had skipped meals, the jobs I had worked until my body ached, the dreams I had put on hold indefinitely. And then I thought about the vacations, the renovations, the luxury that had surrounded them during those same years. It hadn't been coincidence or luck, it had been funded by what was meant for me. They hadn't simply ignored my needs, they had thrived at my expense. The proof reshaped everything. My childhood, once defined by favoritism, was now exposed as something even more sinister. The comparisons, the dismissals, the endless praise of my sister. It had all been part of a system that elevated her by stripping me down. I had been cast as the resilient one, not because of strength, but because they had decided I didn't deserve ease. Every hardship I endured had been orchestrated by their choices, not fate. The weight of that realization was crushing. For so long, I had internalized the idea that I was lesser, that my struggles were a reflection of my inadequacy. Seeing the proof shattered that illusion, but it also left me grieving for the life I might have had. The years of struggle had not been necessary, they had been engineered. The opportunities I thought I had missed through bad luck or lack of effort had been stolen before I even had the chance to reach for them. Holding that proof in my hands, I felt both fury and vindication. Fury at the scale of their betrayal, and vindication that I had not been paranoid or delusional, as they had tried to convince me. The gaslighting, the denial, the attempts to paint me as dramatic, all of it crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. For the first time, I had something that could not be erased or rewritten. But with that proof came a new kind of burden. Knowing the truth was one thing, deciding what to do with it was another. I could no longer hide behind uncertainty, no longer tell myself that maybe I was wrong. The evidence demanded action, but action meant escalation. To use it was to declare war, to sever what little remained of the fragile ties that bound us. It meant exposing them not just to me, but to everyone. In that moment, I understood that the proof was not simply a collection of documents, it was a choice. I could remain silent, continue to carry the weight alone, or I could bring it into the light and let the world see them for who they truly were. Neither option would undo the years of betrayal, but one would at least reclaim the power they had stolen from me. The proof had changed everything. It had confirmed my worst fears, validated my deepest suspicions, and forced me to confront the reality I had long tried to avoid. There was no longer any space for doubt, no room for illusion. My family had not only failed me, they had deliberately orchestrated my destruction. and with the truth finally in my hands, I knew there was no going back. Once the proof was in my hands, the silence that had defined my life was no longer sustainable. For years, my family had relied on denial, on their ability to manipulate perception and twist reality into whatever narrative kept them safe. But the document stripped them of that power. There was no interpretation, no excuse, no rewriting. It was theft, pure and undeniable. And once the truth began to seep out beyond the confines of our home, everything they had worked so hard to protect began to collapse. The exposure was not explosive at first. It was quiet, like a slow leak that becomes impossible to contain. People who had once admired them, defended them, even envied them, began to see through the cracks. Their wealth, their comfort, their carefully cultivated image of discipline and success. It all started to look different under the weight of the evidence. What had once been seen as earned began to be recognized as stolen. The fallout came in waves. Extended family distanced themselves almost immediately, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Friends who had once crowded around my parents and my sister at social gatherings disappeared, their calls unanswered, their invitations rescinded. The house that had once been a symbol of their status became a prison of isolation, its doors closed to the world that no longer admired them. Financially, the walls closed in as well. Accounts were frozen, assets investigated, and properties scrutinized. What they had built on my inheritance, on the resources meant for me, was slowly stripped away. Vacations were canceled, renovations halted, luxuries repossessed. For the first time, my sister experienced scarcity, though not nearly to the degree I had lived with for years. Watching her stumble in the face of even mild discomfort was a strange kind of vindication. She, who had always lived in excess, now had to face the reality of limits. The legal consequences loomed larger than I had expected. What they had done was not just immoral, it was criminal. The transfers, the mismanagement, the fraudulent signatures all pointed to a pattern of deception that went beyond family betrayal. Authorities became involved, not because I demanded it, but because the paper trail demanded it. Their actions were too blatant, too careless, to remain hidden once uncovered. And as the investigations deepened, their defenses weakened. For me, it was a surreal experience. For years, I had been gaslit into believing that my struggles were a product of my own shortcomings, that my anger was overreaction, that my suspicions were paranoia. Now, the very people who had dismissed me as dramatic were scrambling under the weight of truths they could no longer deny. The balance of power shifted, not because I sought revenge, but because reality finally refused to bend to their illusions. Yet, even as justice came, it did not bring the satisfaction I had imagined. Watching them lose everything they had stolen should have felt like victory, but instead, it felt hollow. Nothing could give me back the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, the anxiety of living on the edge of collapse while they thrived on what was mine. Their downfall did not erase my scars, it only confirmed how deep they ran. Still, there was power in knowing that they could no longer pretend. Their lies had caught up with them, and the world could now see them for what they truly were. They were no longer untouchable, no longer admired, no longer capable of hiding behind the facade they had built. The justice was imperfect, incomplete, but it was real. For the first time, I felt the weight of their control lift from my shoulders. They could no longer gaslight me into silence, no longer twist the truth to make me doubt myself. The documents, the investigations, the consequences, they were all proof that my reality had been real all along. I had not been paranoid, I had not been dramatic, I had been betrayed, and now the world knew it too. The consequences did not fix me, but they freed me, and that freedom, fragile as it was, became the foundation of what I would build next. When the dust finally began to settle, I was left standing among the ruins of what had once been my family. The collapse was total. Reputations destroyed, finances in disarray, trust obliterated. For so long, I had imagined this moment as a kind of victory, a dramatic restoration of balance where justice would be enough to heal me. But when it arrived, it felt different. Justice had come, yes, but healing was something else entirely. That part was mine to build, and it would take more than their downfall to create. In the weeks that followed, I found myself grappling with an unfamiliar kind of silence. For years, my life had been filled with noise, arguments, accusations, denials, and the endless cycle of comparisons that had defined me. Now, there was only quiet. My phone no longer buzzed with their demands or manipulations. I no longer carried the weight of wondering what they thought of me, of waiting for the next betrayal. The silence felt strange at first, unsettling, like standing in an empty room that had once been crowded. But slowly it became comforting. For the first time in my life, peace was possible. The rebuilding of my life moved forward in small steps, but they were mine. I found a new place to live, modest but stable, and furnished it with things I chose for myself rather than whatever scraps had been handed down. Each piece of furniture, each decoration felt symbolic, a reminder that I was creating a home that no one could take from me. It was not lavish, but it was mine, built with honesty instead of lies. Financially, I began to recover too. What little remained of what had been stolen was eventually restored to me through the investigations, and while it was only a fraction of what I should have had, it was enough to create stability. I started a proper savings account, built a budget that included not just survival but growth, and for the first time, I felt secure. The constant fear that had shadowed me for years, the fear of collapse, of not being able to keep going, began to fade. More important than the financial recovery, though, was the emotional one. I had spent so long defining myself by what I had lost, by the ways I had been overlooked and diminished, that it was difficult to imagine who I was without that pain. Slowly, I began to learn. I found strength in my work, in the recognition of my efforts, and the opportunities that followed. Each success felt like a reclamation, proof that I could build something lasting without their interference. I also allowed myself to lean into the relationships I had once kept at a distance. Friends who had stood quietly by my side became my chosen family, offering support that asked for nothing in return. Their presence reminded me that love did not have to be conditional, that loyalty could exist without manipulation. For the first time, I surrounded myself with people who saw me not as a resource, not as a shadow, but as a person worth knowing in my own right. The contrast between my new life and my family's downfall was stark. While I was slowly rising, they were unraveling. My parents, stripped of the wealth they had stolen, lived now in a kind of exile, shunned by the very circles they had once fought to impress. My sister, once untouchable, struggled to adjust to a world where her name no longer commanded admiration. Their collapse was complete, and while I did not rejoice in their suffering, I could not ignore the irony. They had spent years destroying me to elevate themselves, and in the end, it was their own actions that destroyed them. But my story was no longer about them. That was the most important shift of all. For so long, my identity had been entwined with theirs, my narrative shaped by their betrayal. Now, finally, I began to write a different story, one that belonged to me. My scars remained, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders, yes, but also markers of resilience. Proof that I had endured what should have broken me. Healing did not mean forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not ever. I did not need to absolve them of what they had done in order to move forward. What I needed was distance, boundaries, and the freedom to create a life untouched by their destruction. That, I realized, was forgiveness enough, forgiving myself for ever believing their lies, for carrying their weight, for letting their voices define me. As months turned into a year, I found myself thriving in ways I had once thought impossible. I built a career I was proud of, saved enough to dream of a future that included more than survival, and surrounded myself with people who gave me the kind of loyalty my family never had. I learned to enjoy small things again. Morning coffee, long walks, evenings spent in the quiet comfort of a home that finally felt like mine. The betrayal would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. It was not the final chapter, but the turning point, the place where everything broke, and in breaking, revealed who I truly was. I had been diminished, erased, and stolen from, but in the end, I had rebuilt myself stronger than they ever imagined I could be. When I look back now, I see the years of pain differently. They were not wasted, though they felt that way at the time. They were lessons, brutal and unwanted, but lessons nonetheless. They taught me resilience, independence, and the value of choosing who belongs in my life. My family had been given every advantage, every resource, and still destroyed themselves. I had been given nothing, and I survived. That, more than anything, is what defines me now. If there is one truth I carry from all of this, it is that family is not defined by blood. Family is built on trust, on love, on loyalty freely given. My family had destroyed me, But I found something better in the people who stood by me when I had nothing left to give. That is the family I choose, the one I will carry forward into the life I continue to build. And as I sit here now telling this story, I realize the most important thing of all: survival is not enough. I did not just survive them, I became more. I became whole without them.